Hello, everyone, and welcome to the bonus episode of The X-Files with me, Christiane Amanpour, and Jamie Rubin. This is our Q&A episode. We're going to answer your questions as we do every week, so thanks to everyone who sent them in, and do keep sending them in. Ask us whatever you like. And don't forget, you can find us on social media. Our handle is @AmanpourPod, or email us. We're amanpourpod@global.com. So let's get started.
Christine on Threads, what are your views on AI? Are there any upsides? Trump's use of deepfake videos, e.g. Obama being arrested, demonstrate the downsides. Should more guardrails be put in place? You want to start?
Yeah, I will. I think, like everything, including social media, guardrails should be in place. There should be rules. We've seen what happens when there are not, and when only the profit motive takes over. It means that it's a free-for-all, and that you simply do not know what you're getting, what's true, what's not, what the algorithm is moving you towards, what's the rest of the world talking about. You're just getting tunnel vision. And with AI, of course, it's so much easier. Deep fakes are really dangerous. You just mentioned the one about Obama being arrested, Christine. Of course, he wasn't arrested. And then many, many others. I mean, they make journalists out of AI. They pretend they're somebody famous or whatever. And they can be very, very dangerous. There's obviously a lot of areas where people are excited about AI, in science, in medicine, in all sorts of other things, and to help in some kind of rudimentary tasks. But Jamie, the whole business about, generative and apparently trying to get close to what human beings can do or take over from human beings, that's a fantasy that I don't want to go near.
Yes. Well, let me just give you an example of an AI that I would love. If they could create an AI that could sort through all your various applications like Netflix and Prime and Disney and all of the various ways you used to watch TV just on one box with one channel, if they could sort through all that and make sure that wherever you had your own service provided to you, and you didn't have to do all these complicated maneuvers that only Darius can figure out, our son, that I can't figure out, AI would make my life better. But
Are
in
you
the
sure it
meantime,
doesn't exist? I mean, don't we already have
it may
Apple
exist, but
TV?
it must be a way to sort through all this. So you just say, I want to watch on Apple TV X. And then it does all the steps that drive me absolutely crazy. But in the meantime, there's two big problems with AI. Number one, like social media, the owners of AI are monstrously believing in their own greatness. And they don't understand that technology has downsides. They don't understand that the social media was like a pollution, and we had to figure out how to put a filter on it through regulation. The same thing has to be done with AI. We have to make sure it doesn't pollute our world. Let me give you an example. There's a new AI app that can create fake videos instantly. What will that do? Well, it might be fun for people to create fake videos, but in the meantime, that will put a question mark about all videos. Will you ever be able to believe a video? So we need the government to do things that government is there for, to build foundations and guardrails. My favorite story from 9/11, you may remember this, was when the airspace shut down. And at that time in 2001, the investment bankers were the most arrogant people in the world. They were making billions of dollars. They thought they were the rulers of the world. And suddenly they noticed that with the airspace shut down, they couldn't rebuild their marketplace on Wall Street. They couldn't get the wires and the equipment and the technology from California to New York to rebuild their trading floors. And they needed help from the government in a time of crisis. And that's what government is there for, to give you basic guardrails. If we don't let guardrails be put in place, and we have generative AI making decisions about warfare or law or who gets arrested or anything that involves the use of force, we'd be crazy. And so I certainly hope that AI is controlled, is regulated, and at some point people realize that a combination of government and technological progress makes our world better, but one without the other doesn't.
And of course, there is no guardrail in the United States around social media. So it's a big, big warning sign that it'll take a huge amount more effort to make this happen around AI. Okay, Annette on YouTube wants to know the United Nations 2024 annual statistics showed 66,000 women and girls were murdered as a result of femicide, and that those rates are increasing annually even as they are underreported. How can the media affect change in our global societies and bring these heinous facts to the forefront of public awareness? Why don't you talk about that from the perspective of a former government spokesman who actually has to address these things? And I can add something from the perspective of the media.
Look, one of the big challenges for American foreign policy in the last 10, 15 years is to what extent do we insist on our values being applied in other countries? So, for example, the famous, gender issues, the famous issues of gender equality, the famous issues of homosexuality, where the rights of lesbians and gays, et cetera, were deemed appropriate in our system. To what extent do we try to apply those in other countries? Now, oddly enough, Donald Trump, when he was elected in 2016, gave a speech to the United Nations saying that it's none of the United States' business what goes on in other countries, that sovereign states have a right to decide what to do in their own states, and that the world is made up of sovereign states. Funny, now he's trying to decide exactly what goes on in Brazil and trying to impose American values on the Brazilian legal system or on the way they're dealing with social media. And he wants to break his claim to believing in sovereign states. The reason I bring this up is because we did develop reporting on gender issues where the oppression of women was reported in regular human rights reports. And we had a famous Hillary Clinton insisted on having representatives travel the world and propose our belief that when women get a full and equal treatment in societies, the society benefits. But the problem is they run into countries which don't believe in that. Let's face it. There are African countries that don't believe in it. There are African countries, some of whom still have a kind of slavery in existence. So the problem here, I think, has to start with getting the facts out and then figuring out a way to put pressure on those countries where this is happening, but not pressure where the United States becomes some dictator of what the values of other countries should be. And I think
Okay.
one of the lessons I learned as a Democrat in the last administration is we probably did too much to insist on our social standards being applied in foreign countries and spent too much capital on that when we should have focused on the big issues of our time, which are things like AI and China and Russia, and leave their internal workings to a large extent to the sovereign states. That doesn't mean we shouldn't talk about it. Doesn't mean we shouldn't raise questions, but we probably made it too high a priority in our foreign policy and became very unpopular as a result around the world.
So I'm going to take a completely different tack because I disagree 1000% with you when it comes to the issue of women and femicide. Women make up half the world's population. It is only logical that a country as evolved as the United States should put them and their rights, including the right not to be, femicide not to be allowed in certain
By the way,
countries.
I
If they
need to
want,
distinguish
I
just
know,
to
but let me
show
just
that I'm not
finish.
an idiot. I didn't
I
mean in the
know.
case of murder. I
I
just
know.
was making a
I
different
know.
point.
But that was the question. The question is that it is increasing according to the United Nations, and the United Nations needs to have, the support of all the members of the Security Council, which is, difficult, all the powerful countries. And by the way, it's not just Africa that does this about women. It's also many of the Islamic countries and other countries around the world as well. And it is time and beyond time that so-called democratic countries that believe in basic human rights, I believe, should use human rights and women's rights as a barometer of how their governments are going to deal with said countries. Now, in the case of Afghanistan, we have seen that the country was handed back to the Taliban with only a nominal view and just sort of lip service to the rights of women. For 20 years, while the US was in Afghanistan, the rights of women were upheld to a huge degree, much larger than at any time in the past 50 odd years. And women did unbelievably well, and it really propelled Afghanistan to a much more solid economic and social standing in the world. And in my view, imperative. And I know I differ with you on this, Jamie, and you've explained why, but women and should be a barometer. How they treat women and girls should be a barometer all over the world in some form or fashion.
Let me just say, before we go on, because you're right, we have a slight disagreement about the priority, not the whether the issue matters.
I think it's
Afghanistan
a priority.
is a great issue because here's what happened. The Democratic Party on the left saw the war as a forever war. They didn't want to continue the war. And yet the Democratic Party wanted to protect the rights of women in Afghanistan. And this contradiction at the core of the Democratic Party's values, protecting women in Afghanistan, came up against the Democratic Party's willingness to keep troops in Afghanistan. And that's how the President Biden decided to pull them out, following up on Trump's
All I'm
plan.
just going to say
so it
on
just
this,
shows you how these needs and conflicts can combine to make an impossible situation. You want to end the war, but you want to protect the rights of women in Afghanistan. Show me how you do that.
I am just going to say that I find it absurd. It's just absurd. The entire U.S. Decades of U.S. policy towards places like Afghanistan and elsewhere is absurd, because you've just mentioned about Biden and the left, and then Trump and the right. He's the one who pulled the troops out or negotiated that. And guess what? Now they're talking about wanting to go back to Bagram. Sorry, it makes no sense. So it makes no sense geostrategically. It makes no sense politically, and it certainly makes no sense when it comes to the rights and the human rights of individuals, especially women. And let's go on, let's move on. And say on YouTube, why has there been no pushback by the US government on Israel's illegal arrests of 400 plus activists on the Freedom Flotilla, Jamie?
Because President Trump is mostly in Bibi Netanyahu's pocket until Netanyahu does something so stupid as to try to attack the Hamas leaders in Doha, and then infuriates Trump, and then Trump pushes for a peace plan. This is what happens when the United States is too supportive of Israel and doesn't hold them to account. I remember in government, here's a story. I remember going with Tony Blinken to Israel on several occasions and watching him walk through with the defense minister in Israel the number of trucks, the number of blankets, the number of doctors, the number of amount of food, the number of people that were brought in for humanitarian reasons. He was prepared to use his leverage as Secretary of State to walk through all these details. Donald Trump's administration doesn't do that. They basically finally had enough and said that he'd have to agree to the peace plan because of this attack in Qatar. But on a daily basis, they did nothing, as far as I can tell, to pressure the Israeli government to let enough food and medicine and shelter into Gaza. That's why people were starving to death and people were dying from starvation. And that's the same issue here. Israel is trying to deny that there's a humanitarian crisis by keeping these people out. And the United States government doesn't want to be any part of it because Donald Trump doesn't want to criticize Netanyahu. That's why.
And for too long, unfortunately, that has been the narrative. And what seems to have happened is a lot of them have been, they landed, they were arrested and deported back to their own countries, like has happened before. But it is an extraordinary situation. I'm going to go back to my own story. Reporting in Sarajevo under siege for 4 years. It was under siege. And yet the international community managed to have at least a modicum of human decency. They refused to stop the genocide in Bosnia, but they did airdrop food and aid and basic necessities. I cannot believe to this day that the United States did not just take C-130s and land them in Gaza with food for starving people and dare the Israelis to shoot down a US plane. It would never have happened. It's an outrage. It should have happened. And now look where we are. The whole world isolating Israel, the hostages hopefully soon to come back, the ceasefire hopefully soon under the conditions Jamie just said, because Trump got pissed off with Netanyahu for bombing Doha, soon to get some humanitarian aid and maybe a ceasefire eventually to lead to some kind of peace plan. But it is a disgrace that basic human, necessities to keep body and soul together have been forbidden for all this time. It's a disgrace. and we report on it all the time. Jamie, you want to read the next one?
Given that the United States is often the only nation, aside from Israel and a few small island states, to veto or reject resolutions calling for peace or ceasefires in Gaza, while nearly every other country votes in favor, does this not also undermine, weaken, or neuter the UN's authority? This is a really good question, and it's one that foreign policy types struggle with. The United Nations, as we've said before last week and the week before, is a complicated thing. There are agencies that deliver real goods, UNICEF, United Nations Human Rights Groups, the refugee organizations, they do actual work. Then there's the Security Council, which purports to rule on how countries behave around the world. The problem is, on the Security Council stand three countries: China, Russia, and the United States. They're generally the countries whose vetoes prevent the UN Security Council from actually pursuing international peace and security. Now, Israel and the United States often oppose resolutions like the one that would relate to Gaza that we've been talking about. And why does the United States do that? Well, we've talked about that endlessly, because of the support for Israel, and Israel viewing the UN as unfair. Whether that's true or not doesn't matter. It views it as unfair. And in cases I've seen, it is actually unfair. And we can go through that some other day. But meanwhile, the big problem is not the US resolutions that it vetoes. That's not the problem with the UN. The problem with the UN is two of the permanent members, Russia and China, do not believe in the basic rules of the international system. They believe in the power of the bully and the strong to oppress the weak. The United States, for all its flaws and for all its mistakes, most of the time on most issues believes the states should be not bullied and not invaded. Russia believes it should invade Ukraine and not pay a price. China believes it can oppress the people of its own country, and it can potentially invade Taiwan, and it can do pretty much whatever it wants in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, and it's nobody else's business because they're the biggest country in the region. So those two countries, one ruled by a communist party, the other ruled by a Russian dictator, are the reasons why the UN is no longer a serious place to do international business, because Russia and China have destroyed it. And I think that the United States shouldn't be blamed for the UN's failure. China won't even negotiate an arms control agreement, Christiane. Today or yesterday, Donald Trump said he would follow the New START agreement that Putin said he would continue. Well, here's the problem. China isn't part of any arms control agreement and refuses to be part of it and wants to build 1,500 nuclear weapons. How can China be a serious player internationally and say that despite signing the NPT and committing to disarmament, it's going to triple, quadruple, and quintuple the size of its nuclear forces? They are violating the article of the NPT that calls for disarmament every day by their buildup, and nobody calls them on it. That's how the UN's authority is ruined.
I'm just going to go back to the things you said that it does well, which is mostly in the humanitarian sphere: UNHCR, UNICEF, WFP, all the organizations that sustain body and soul around the world. Unfortunately, the United States has cut a lot of aid and support to all those, humanitarian agencies. It's in arrears. In many of them, it has put sanctions also on Palestinian human rights organizations. It's been called out, the United States, by, Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. It's very selective, the United States, on its issues as well. And I've covered this for a long, long time. But I would say, and it was part of my recommendation a few weeks ago, it wasn't always like this. There's always been, issues of sovereignty and, I guess, imperialism by all the members of the Security Council versus trying to work together to make the world a better and safer place and bring more peace than war. So go back and read Peacemaker, about the third Secretary General, Yu Thant, written by his grandson and my friend Thant Mint U. It's so interesting to read what was going on in the 60s and 70s compared to what's going on now. Yeah. You're the next one, Jamie.
All right. So as Trump is cutting Democratic programs with Democratic purposes and ideals in Democratic districts, this is Patricia on email, are Democrats off the hook to support these actions by providing their tax dollars? The short answer to that is no. The Democrats presumably believe in these programs. And frankly, we're going to get to this in the next question, are committed to facing the heat of a government shutdown in favor of providing assistance to those who need health care. And so in these districts that the questioner asks about, local governments, state governments are trying to step in to provide more and more support. And one of the great things that's gone on in the last couple decades without a lot of attention is state governments and local governments are getting better, and people are getting more involved in their democracy. Look, we're a representative democracy. We can't have voters decide every single issue. We can't have an Athenian democracy. I was reading about that recently. Can you imagine if 51% of the voters who are poisoned by social media made every decision for our government? That would be a disaster. We have to have representative democracy, which means that you vote in people you respect and trust. And one of the new philosophies that's come out recently is that by controlling the way leaders behave through too much legal regulation, we've taken away the authority of leaders to act and be held accountable and make good decisions where you can't know in advance the situation. There's no regulation. There's no legal processes for many of the new issues the world faces. You have to trust your leaders to do the right thing. And if they're not doing it, you vote them out. But to expect us to have legal procedures for every single problem is one of the reasons it's so hard to build a new airport or to have the infrastructure built in California or New York, because we have too many of the local politicians who are afraid to act for fear of being criticized for raising tolls. That's how you build a new bridge. You raise tolls. And if we don't want to have lousy infrastructure, we have to pay for it.
Yeah, they do it very well in Europe. And actually, in this government shutdown, you've seen President Trump already cut off, I think it's hundreds of millions of dollars in infrastructure to places like New York and other places.
Exactly.
Ellie on Instagram, as a very confused Scot, can you please explain why the US government has shut down and the impact this will have? In addition, can you please explain why Trump's administration is blaming the Democrats for the shutdown? Over to you, Jamie.
All right. This is interesting, and I want to be very, I hope, truthful. The Republicans are willing to continue government in what's called a clean resolution, meaning you just continue doing what you're doing now and pay for what you're paying for and what's on the books. And they would be willing to vote to open the government tomorrow if things just stayed the same. And so it is true that the Democrats are insisting on making some changes in current law as a price for their votes to open the government. The Senate needs needs Democratic votes to pass a resolution to open the government. They need 60 votes. There are enough Democrats who won't vote with the Republicans. That's why the government is shut down. The Democrats are saying, if you want us to support you, remember, Republicans own the House, the Senate, the executive branch, the presidency, the judiciary. This is their government. And for them to blame the Democrats is ridiculous. They own the government right now. But the Democrats are saying, if you want our help, then you have to give us something we believe in. And what we believe in is assistance for middle-class families trying to get health care in a country that doesn't have a national health service, that doesn't have the system the French have, or the Scandinavians have, or the Canadians have, or the British have, or any European country. We don't have national health care. So middle-class families have to pay for it. The Democrats are saying we need to give them some help because it's too expensive. And I can tell you, as not a middle class, as an upper middle class person, healthcare in the United States is obscenely expensive, and it really costs a lot of money. And so the Democrats are saying we need to provide some help to the middle class families, the 20 million or so that got Obamacare, that the Republicans want to prevent.
And I think it's important to know, in my opinion anyway, watching from overseas, that the first Trump administration, just because it was Obama, decided they were going to torpedo Obamacare. And they tried and they tried and they tried and they couldn't. And in fact, they lost their majority during the midterm elections. Back then, the Democrats successfully campaigned on delivering health care and keeping health care for people. And that's why they understand that this is really important. This is something the Republicans under Trump, and maybe even before, I don't know, but when Obamacare came in, Trump decided, I guess because it was called Obamacare, it's actually the Affordable Care Act, that they were going to kill this thing. and it's survived, but they're trying to kill it by other means. And so the Democrats are saying, no, we need you to actually be very solid, as Jamie said, in making sure that people, and it affects tens of millions of Americans. It's a huge, big deal because often if you can't get your health care, you get bankrupted. Bottom line, that's it for us, right, Jamie?
Yes, I think we've answered questions as best as we can and been as truthful and as honest as we can be, even forthcoming sometimes.
Even sometimes forthcoming. So thank you for listening to the Q&A bonus episode of The X-Files with me, Christiane Amanpour, and Jamie Rubin. If you have a question that you want answered, just go ahead and send it to us. You can do it on email, on our social media. You can find us on all the major social media platforms. The handle is at amanpourpod, or the email is amanpourpod@global.com. Our next episode, as always, is out on Tuesday. Wherever you get your podcast, remember you can listen for free on Global Player. You can download that from the App Store or go to globalplayer.com. You can also watch our episodes on YouTube, so sign up for our YouTube channels. You can watch the episodes and the bonus Q&As now on that. You search Christiane Amanpour Presents and subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode. And we'll see you next week. Bye-bye, Jamie.
Goodbye from New York.
Bye.
I love saying that.